Our first panel will jump into the role, challenges, and benefits of these types of studies and understanding the potential benefits of cannabinoid-based products. And today, joining me on stage, we have Dr. Hans Clark, the Director of Pain Services and the Pain Research Unit, and staff anesthesiologist at Toronto General Hospital. Recently, he was appointed as President of the Canadian Pain Society, and Dr. Clark is leading a prospective non-interventional observational study to understand the benefits of medical cannabis in patients with chronic pain, sleep, anxiety, and depression. With us is Aaron Prosk, President and co-founder of Santé Cannabis, a medical cannabis clinic that conducts research services, including real-world evidence and clinical studies. Santé Cannabis has contributed both through patient advocacy, care of patients, and has established educational content and serves as an important space for developing evidence-based medicines and optimizing patient care. Please join me. So thank you both for joining us today, and really excited to speak to both of you, as both of you have demonstrated a lot of progress in research and the efforts behind understanding cannabinoid-based medicines for patients and delivering care for patients, both looking at maintaining the opportunity for patients to have access to cannabinoids, but also managing the risk. So appreciate the time for you guys to be here today. I want to start with you, Dr. Clark. You're about to relaunch your real-world evidence study in June. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you're looking to measure?
Sure, Karolina. So when we started this in, I guess it'd be about 3 years ago now, with the previous company, which was Shoppers, and so we had hoped for significant uptake. We'd hoped for 2,000 patients in a year, and as you can see from the numbers Aras is talking about, a lot changed in the industry in terms of being able to collect that data. So hats off to Avicanna for, we just signed off on it last week, for re-upping in terms of their commitment towards collecting some of this observational data. And so what are we looking for? Well, I heard Peter Carlin earlier speaking, and we've added a neurology component to it, so we've added the epilepsy arm to this. And the difference here about how we're going ahead in terms of moving the observational data forward is it's not just a free-for-all. It's not just throwing a drug into the mix of everything that's happening. It's more of a prospective data point collected, 6 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, and looking at kind of trajectories of these patients. And I had one of our grad students take a look at some of this data over the weekend, so I'll present a couple slides just in terms of what we've seen in a small cohort of about the first 250 patients that have come through. So I think the commitment from you guys was to at least get to 1,000 patients. And again, remember, this is an ecosystem. So anybody in the country authorizing cannabis can use MyMedi and click the yes, we want to be part of this observational data. And what are we looking for? So back to your original question, we're looking for safety. We're looking at, how people are titrating, what doses they're using. We get every piece of information about the products they're consuming on top of the things that we are authorizing. So we can see if we authorize an oil and they're buying vape pens and they're buying all of these other things, we'll get a real lay of the land of what a medical cannabis user still has access to and uses. So I think there's a lot of rich data that we're going to be digging into if we can get all of this done.
And when it comes to your study, you can see that you've controlled for all these variables, but probably 90% of the real-world evidence that exists today, they've taken basically a population and said, here's an app, add your data points, and we hope to understand whether it has particular efficacy. Now, that's obviously making it challenging for healthcare providers to understand what is real or not. And in your experience, how has the structuring of the study been more beneficial to this particular population than just this, let's throw all these subjective questionnaires at patients?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, one of the biggest weaknesses of any observational data is dropout. And so once patients leave, the ultimate story becomes, why did they leave? Adverse effects, wasn't working, et cetera. And so you're stuck with a cohort of patients that truly mostly have a positive story to tell. And so one of the things that we've also done is captured why they stop, why people drop out, what are the reasons for not continuing. So we'll have all of that as part of the prospective observational data. If you look at even some of the data that was presented in the EB population, 30%, I think, of folks stopped using it, 60% continued. So that's a pretty clear signal that there's some benefit there. And I often say cannabis is not the panacea, nor is any drug we prescribe. If you look at, gabapentinoids in pain, if you have 1/3 of people who actually show an effect, that's a big deal. Here you're seeing at least that 1/3 signal for folks that are sticking with these cannabinoid-based medicine products.
Oh, that's great. And Aaron, you've taken a little bit of a different approach and have had experience running many different real-world observational studies. Can you tell us about how you guys are approaching this now?
I think a big change in the last few years, we have had a big increase in access, and that will affect every study, whether it's a clinical trial that's trying to recruit naive cannabis patients, good luck finding them. But finding those channels where we can actually access patients, engage with patients to understand also what we should be studying and how we can really advance. Because one of the things that's really overlooked by researchers is what is a patient being incentivized in this study. And I'm not just talking about paying them for funding for their time or giving access to a free product, but patients want to participate in research that will affect change. And one of the downfalls of the last while is that we haven't had a strong dissemination of even the research that has happened. And so, your presentation here really brought a lot of light to that and making sure that we can share that back with patients. And so I think a big important thing looking forward in the type of research that we're looking at is that, what are the challenges that are still really affecting the medical cannabis advancements and the ability for patients to access the type of products that could really bring change to their lives. So I think the control inside the clinic is really important, looking at those questions that clinicians still have. But I think a big part is also how are we ever going to overcome the medical stigma without the level of clinical trials that they're expecting to see for an approved drug. And I think that's, patients would be very, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, would be motivated to participate in research thinking that it will change the medical practice and that doctors will be more open. But here we are, 25 years into medical cannabis in Canada, and we're still struggling with that same medical stigma. So lots of points really to discuss, but I think, digging into real world evidence and really challenging the gold standard of RCTs is really critical in 2024 and beyond.
And you've been able to use a little bit of a different approach in that you're able to select, like in our study, just one product and focus in on it. How has that changed over time, and what do you think the benefit of that will be?
I think we're really sort of pushing the limits of the boundaries of observational research, and that's really why we'd like to see it also push the boundaries of that bottom rung of the evidence pyramid. Because with medical cannabis, we actually have an opportunity with products inside the clinical setting to assess and study, what's really going on with these products. So it's the relationship between clinicians that are very, active in prescribing, exploring new products for their patients, wanting to know, what titration regimen they should be following, which patient should be considered for different products. So I think that it's really important sort of working with those clinicians that are very engaged and very active with their patients, supporting them, resourcing them to engage in observational study and be able to publish and disseminate their results. And I think that also we've learned a lot. I mean, with the, in our clinic, researchers are on one side of the clinic and clinicians are on the other. And still the researchers will say, hey, let's try this. And the, clinicians will want to try something else. So I think we're always learning and always having to iterate how we can best get over the hurdles that exist, but also, maximize our resources to bring as much change as possible.
I think you bring up a great point there of that division still that sometimes exists between research and clinicians. And I guess, Dr. Clark, when you look at what you're doing with this real-world evidence studies and other studies you've been involved in, how can that feed back into clinical experience and being able to adapt that to patients? And has that changed your perspective on guidance with patients?
Well, I think we have to take a step back even further, Karolina. So why are we here? We're here because patients asked for this to happen. And so if you go back to 2000, when Canada created their medical access platform, that wasn't physicians asking cannabis to be into this space. It was patients saying, hey, we're using this. This is something that is helping us. And we all had patients that were consuming before 2014 and getting arrested and all these social justice type issues that were ongoing. So now you move this into our space, and then you look at the expert panel recommendations that ARAS put up, and you look at the fact that the CMA weren't even at the table to discuss some of these things, and it speaks volumes for what people had expected these recommendations to look like. And they had hoped, so I think some of the medical community had hoped that they would have just said, enough of medical cannabis, let's move on with the recreational world and just call it a day. And that's not where we landed. And so, that panel had a lot of input from patients, had a lot of input from physicians practicing in this space. And when you look at what one of those recommendations specifically were, it was to leverage existing observational data to inform RCTs. And the reason we're in this space is you couldn't get an RCT approved in Canada because not a single company was making something that was of pharmaceutical grade to land there. So companies like Avicanna now are doing that, and we now have products that if we can land them into a randomized controlled trial, we can actually potentially move that payee part of this forward, access this for the millions of Canadians that would like to trial cannabis in a way that is akin to other medications. And so we're here because this was the only space we had, and that's the observational space. And we've tried to collect it now in a way that we can show some at least benefits that we can link back to the drug itself and not just this love of cannabis, and that's why you're showing a positive effect and can't get these things published.
Yeah, that's a great point. And again, it comes back down to we do need to get to the RCT level, and how are we going to get there? But also, on the other hand, when are we going to get there? If we keep waiting around for the next decade, there's still patients that are seeking medical cannabis. And one of the presentations Dr. Carlo De Angelis will give today really highlights some of that need for still having that physician discussion with patients rather than turning them away and saying there's no level of evidence. And I'm excited for Carlo's presentation, but I wanted to bring that back to one of the recommendations. So one of the recommendations that the recent legislation did speak about was creating a surveillance type of platform to look at safety and as well as tolerability for patients. And I'll let either of you answer this, but do you think that in the meantime, real-world evidence can be structured in a way to help deliver that?
I think this is one of the primary roles for real-world evidence because really, it is that strength of, the real-world setting. I mean, patients coming into Santé Cannabis are on an average of 8.5 concomitant medications when they start their treatment. And the reason they're there is because those medications, many of them, not been effective or have negative side effects, and the patient's looking for other options, or their referring doctor is, lost, doesn't have anything else to turn to. And so the idea of, that we're going forward with these continued, decisions in the clinic without a really robust nationally sponsored pharmacovigilance program for these products is really unacceptable, especially when the government is making now so much revenue from the sale of cannabis products. And it's really critical that we engage with clinicians that are seeing many, many patients and support and fund them to participate in Canada's vigilance program. Health Canada asks us every year for our adverse event data, anything that we haven't submitted on the sort of standardized form, and it's very difficult to find the resources to present and prepare information for Health Canada, but it's so important, it's so critical. And moving into pharmacy, which is on our horizon, another one of the recommendations. This is very important and valuable data that we need to assemble and then engage pharmacists for that important role to continue to understand the safety of cannabis products.
Thank you, Erin.
Not much to add to that.
Perfect. So one of the things going forward, if we are to use real-world evidence study, there are a lot of limitations, and I do want to highlight those. But there's also a few benefits that we can look at distinct populations and that we can hone down into specific therapeutic indications. I'll start with you, Erin. Have you seen that in your space where you've been able to collect all the patients over the years? And I believe you could speak better to, there's over 10,000 patients that you've worked with. But in all of those, you've been collecting that data and you've been able to see what type of products, because in your clinic, you guys are prescribing specific products for those patients. And on MyMedi, we honor that. So we hope that those patients are using those products, which again comes back to providing you better data. Where do you think this will go, and how can we get there?
I mean, I think that, moving forward, we have to really think about building structure for clinicians to really, share resources. It's really disappointing that the Canadian Medical Association doesn't engage, because I don't think that's representative of clinicians in their offices being very, wanting to do the best for their patients. But since legalization, we have sort of entered a new phase of apathy, where we will hear again from doctors, so many of my patients are taking it, but they can get what they need at the store. I mean, every time I come to Ontario, I take the opportunity to go into one of these stores. I was in one yesterday, more than 500 products, 90% of them smoked and inhaled. We're talking about 6 oils total, 6 capsules, less than 10 products that have any significant quantity of CBD, and those were bath products. So the idea that clinicians would think that their patient with MS and depression who's walking into that store and talking to that 20-year-old will receive any support for their medical condition is really, really disappointing. And I think that brings to light, like, that's objective data that sending a patient to a cannabis store is unethical and irresponsible. And so, I don't blame those clinicians, because I know the state of healthcare in Canada as well. But I think, that this idea that we've legalized cannabis, we're now generating so much revenue and so much government revenue, and not investing in the supports for clinicians to help their patients and for patients to find the support that they need. We have to move forward on this issue. And I think, a big step of it is investing in research in a way that is accessible and sustainable, and leveraging, the experts that are out there in the community and in academia to work together.
So just to touch on Erin's point in terms of physician engagement, so the CMA is one level, but then you guys are also sponsors at our Canadian Pain Society meeting a couple of weeks ago now, and you can see the buzz that is occurring. We're a decade into this now, so cannabis isn't going anywhere. If anything, physicians are now ready to step into the space, and when you are now at credible meetings with 600 individuals and policymakers sitting at the table and listening, you're now realizing that we just need to make this safer for Canadians, and we need to ensure that the individuals that are getting the information, that are trying to use it for whatever medical condition that they are going to use it, have credible data to speak to where they land. And so I think your question was, if I remember, Karolina, was what's next, or what is what are the indications that we think we might see? Well, it's clear that we've only talked about CBD, but there is a place for THC. I'll have some early data to show some of the audience here what we're seeing in some of our animal models. But there's no doubt that CBD has a place in myofascial pain and fibromyalgia, in some of these spaces where there isn't a significant neuropathic component. In epilepsy, where you're talking about quiescing the nervous system at some level. And so now we've got to just get that data to the place where regulators start to listen, and they want to create the space for companies that are doing the work to deliver it at the level they need to move it forward in the coverage game.
And in terms of the agencies, the healthcare agencies, and including Health Canada, is there money available for researchers currently, or clinicians, to run some of these studies, aside from industry not being able to provide GMP products?
Great question. It's only, $600 million annually of new tax revenue. You would hope that there'd be some programs coming our way at some point in time talking about how we help move this forward. If the recommendations are now, all right, let's have this pharmacovigilance, and let's support RCTs and support moving in parallel streams to get those drugs across the threshold to make it into the pharma space. And so there's got to be something coming. And so hopefully industry and others will start to put that on the radar.
We called C.W.H.L to see if there were any specific cannabis research calls upcoming, and there are none before 2026. We also just missed a great opportunity with the federal budget to show some consideration of excise tax removal for medical cannabis patients. Now in the context of excise tax revenue, medical cannabis is very minimal, especially since a lot of that is going straight back to them in veteran affairs. revenue, so or in the Veteran Affairs budget, let's say. But I think that it's really frustrating to see the pace, the slow pace that things are moving, and to every day be seeing in clinic patients who are suffering because of it, financially, and challenging for them to afford what they need. So we should talk a little bit about some of the positive points, I think maybe around the insurance coverage, because this is one area that is starting to see some development. But again, it's coming at a time where the industry has fewer resources and really needs to sort of pool, information and progress together to be able to bring on these big, what are big files to bring forward, private insurance coverage for specific indications, and to support clinicians to fill out those cost coverage applications, support patients to advocate for themselves with their private insurer. And start to really look at subpopulations where we have seen a lot of benefit. I think I went off on a tangent and missed that point of your question, but patients who have fibromyalgia or Crohn's disease and other conditions where medication cost is actually very high, and a patient who is taking $150 or $200 a month in medical cannabis treatments has the potential to substitute some of those more expensive medications. So I do think that that's also an area inside sort of a controlled perspective observational study to really look at specific populations and try to collect as much data as we can to build that cost effectiveness evidence base, including even healthcare utilization costs. And another example is in pediatrics, of course, where we often see patients who have significant success with CBD treatments. Yes, those treatments will be expensive to cover, but if we're saving hospitalization cost, this is an investment in the quality of life of a patient and family, and a reduction in our overall healthcare burden.
So I guess the only thing I'd say is, from a positive standpoint, if the number from the budget, if anybody remembers this in the room, $192 billion investment over the next 10 years. It's not a small number. It's probably the biggest number they've ever given, because they have to keep giving more because we're just costing a lot more now from a healthcare perspective. And so there is a time for advocacy, and it would be now. There is a certain number that significant stimulus is going to be handed down nationally into the provinces, but also over to C.W.H.L at the research level. So this is the moment you want to have the advocacy for some more cannabis-based research programs.
And one thing I want to add, working with certain insurance groups, we do see that one of the challenges they bring up is the amount of products that are out there. So on each given platform, medical platform, there's options over 300 different products. Ours has 200 products. But we are able to actually customize the formulary specific to those insurance groups. But that's something that they've mentioned that they struggle with too, is when they're trying to understand what should be given to their patients, is which products. And even from both of your perspective, you've seen that on the medical document, and I know Aras mentioned it earlier, that it's just assign your gram equivalency per day, grams per day, which really is not meaningful to any healthcare provider. How would you change that model that we have currently to better optimize care for patients and make physicians more comfortable in prescribing medical cannabis?
I think we're at this point going to need a transition, and quite a long transition. We were careful through the advocacy work with the Cannabis Act review to make sure that they were focused on adding more access options and not taking any away. Canada's history of being challenged in court by patients is not something that we want to go back to. But there are opportunities to sort of build more flexibility, especially now that cannabis is not a controlled substance and it's here, at least literally on every street corner, being sold legally. So we had built, a proposed medical document that included both the old system of the gram authorization and then the option for specific products, specific dosages to be included. And there are others in the room, Dr. Bell and Dr. Pearson, who have advocated for something similar, really allowing those patients who are receiving the very controlled, specific treatment plan to have that ease of access of knowing exactly what products, and the ease for their client care team at their licensed seller to receive that information directly on the medical document and know exactly how to support that patient and clinician. So there's simple changes that can really move us forward, move us towards a future in pharmacy as well. But I think that one of the big challenges as well is in those number of products, the small variations, the changes in carrier oil, these different things that really moving towards a pharmacy model, a cannabis health product model could be standardized to make that job of the healthcare providers easier and to make things more straightforward for patients.
So I think I'll leave the number of products out there to the industry to sort out and figure out who wants to use what product, et cetera. As far as I'm concerned, the biggest discussion, I think some of the ones that we're having now are, we have MME equivalents. What is a standard dose of cannabis? And Alan's going to talk about his guidelines, which I'm looking forward to, in terms of chronic pain and concurrent disorders. So what's your standard dose of THC, and what would that equate to if we were trying to generalize this across the population, whether that's a 2.5 is your standard dose, 5, 10, these are all discussions that we've had, and I think Blake's had them in the past as well. And so it looks as though 2.5 seems to be where people are going to land as a standard initial starting dose for a patient. And when you take a naive patient, that's very different, as we haven't even gone into these discussions, as opposed to a very cannabis experienced individual. A 2.5 milligram dose is not going to do much in the recreational space, but certainly in the medical space, it's a dose that someone will feel or potentially perceive a benefit from, and then you start to look at your adverse events as you climb. From a CBD perspective, well, we have all kinds of numbers that we tend to land on, whether it's 600 milligrams as a high dose for someone with epilepsy, or is it 200 as a reasonable starting dose, or is it 10 that people say are doing miraculous things to them? So, we got a long way to go, I think, before we figured out those standard type dosing.
And I think you made a good point in your presentation, really focusing in on that cavernous gap between isolated cannabinoid products, which are essentially the pharmaceutical cannabinoids that we're more familiar with, and what we are always hearing from patients and in the clinical setting, full spectrum products and how important that full spectrum product is. And in between there's a million different permutations of 100 plus cannabinoids and active ingredients. And so starting to really identify what those components are inside the product, getting away from this idea that full spectrum is best no matter the spectrum, and just moving beyond this, of course, isolated cannabinoids are going to be very limiting, and we need to start to advance or move the needle into what those active ingredients that provide the most benefit actually are. And I think the way to do that is the way that you presented, really to be very structured about it and explore one product at a time. And that's not going to be possible really in an RCT environment. We need to establish the validity of combination products inside real-world evidence. We know that these are safe products. We're not worried about toxicity, but we need to start them in controlled dosing and start to look at those different components and see which patients respond best.
So we have time for one question. There is a mic in the middle if anyone wants to jump up and ask a question. Oh, wow. Well, to wrap that up, is there anything that you guys want to leave on the table that you have thought about over the last 5-6 years in your time working with patients or other healthcare providers that you think would be worthwhile for people to know?
No, I'd say if we're really just thinking about sticking with the theme of real-world evidence and observational data, it's partly the reason we're now at the stage that we can get to these RCTs that we've been, Jason Booth and I have just been awarded a new clinical trials network for the country. And without this observational data, without the signals that you would have seen in the MSK space, in the fibromyalgia space, we wouldn't actually be here. And so kudos to all, the folks in this room and the physicians that have been collecting this data, because without that data, you wouldn't get here. So I think we're almost at the stage where if we keep collecting and we can look at specific products, that we can start to say, all right, here's a big enough sample that we see this signal. Now let's hone in on kind of what we're designing next. The issue is we must know what products people are taking, and that's been the weakness. And that's what things like the MyMedi and some of these other things that have done that were built, because now we can see exactly what the constitution of these drugs that patients have been taking were, that as opposed to just take cannabis and we'll see what that looks like 6 months from now. And so I think that's been the key.
My closing would maybe be a little bit spicier. Dr. Clark is very reserved, but when I got into medical cannabis, it was from an advocacy lens. I'm a data scientist by training, but I was frustrated with the idea that patients, in 2011, we would hear from a doctor that would say, well, all my patients are taking this. They're reporting, that it's helping them with their pain, their mood, their sleep, but I don't know anything about it, and I don't want to get into this. This was when, we were already 10 years into medical cannabis. And to hear a patient now in 2024 say, oh, my doctor won't write a referral to your clinic because they just say I can go to the store, they don't need to know about it, it's helping me, I'm going to the store, but I want to know if it can be better for me. I mean, we've gone full circle on my experience in 13 years. And I really think that this is something that all of us, industry, clinicians, researchers, and patient advocates have to take up. This shouldn't be an apathy issue. We shouldn't be letting patients leaving them on their own to navigate this very complex landscape. So really encouraging everyone to, in your small corner, take as many proactive steps as you can.
I think that's a great finishing statement. And we do have 20 minutes for breaks, so I encourage you to get out there, chat amongst each other. I'll give a 2-minute warning so that everyone can get back in. And, they say don't mess with pregnant women, so please make sure to make it back.